So I'd like to begin by thanking Bill and Yao for inviting me and for being part of this exciting intellectual experiment. For me it is, because as a historian of Islam, as a historian of mystical Islam in a very tiny corner of West Africa, Senegal, I am not used to talking to as many economists and seeing as many graphs and as many numbers that I've seen this meeting and the one we had a few months ago. So I learned a lot from them, and hopefully my very strange case studies would also teach them something. Now, what I would like to do in this paper is to shift the gear a little bit and talk about continental African migration, internal African migration. It's something that we don't talk a lot about. When we think of migration, most of the time we think of people moving from the global south to the north or to the west or to the developing world. We don't think of internal migration. And in the case of Africa that I know better, internal migration is extremely important. In fact, it's the root of transnational migration. People move within Africa, and then from there they step migrate from Africa to elsewhere. And if we can trust the latest number of the OECD, migration within Africa is 7 times, West Africa is 7 times higher important than migration out of Africa. We don't hear about those because they are not on the news. Those of you who are following news about migration, certainly you know that yesterday, Thursday, the European Union was meeting with African leaders in Malta, talking about how to stem the tide of African migrant crossing to Lampedusa, to Mediterranean. They don't talk about those millions of Somalians that live in Kenya, or those thousands of Sudanese that live in Chad, actually, and have been living there for years, and those thousands of Mauritanians living in Senegal and who have been living there for years. I think it's a story that needs to be told. And in fact, myself, I was forced to talk about it. I did not think about it. I'm working on a project on, just to give you an idea of the history of this paper. When Bill and Yao invited me, I was very excited to write about this because the call was already there. I've been working on Senegalese migrant in the United States and Senegalese migrant in Italy, Senegalese migrant in Europe, but I've never thought of really focusing on where these migrants come from, tracing their traces back from where they are in the West to where they are in Africa. And in fact, when Bill and Yao asked me to do this, I just look at my notes, and I remember that all those African Senegalese migrants living in the West that I actually interviewed would tell me, okay, I came to Paris in 1980, but yet I was in Abidjan, Ivory Coast, before I came here. Or they will told me, I was actually in Kinshasa before I came here, or I was in Libreville before I came here. So the continuity is extremely important. Now, more specifically, what I would like to do in this paper is to show, in some ways, how economic entrepreneurship can be rooted in spiritual belief and can be rooted in history. So my hypothesis is that among the Murid, and I'll say more about the history of the Murid later, how in some ways the memory of the founder, Cheikh Ahmadou Bamba himself, his own mobility in some ways, and Murid belief creates some, what you might call some a psychological, or what you might call some behavior shaping values. Those behavior shaping values could be, for example, trust. It could be risk-taking. It could be frugality. It could be communality. And what I try to do in the case studies that I looked at, 2 case studies here, is to see how those values in some way was central in empowering the Murid trade network, and in some ways playing a role in what people call a migration success story. But as a historian, I would like to begin from the beginning, and the beginning is Ahmadou Bamba, Cheikh Ahmadou Bamba. He is the founder of the Murid Order. I think my next slide is about him. Right here is the picture of Ahmadou Bamba. Some of you who might be paying more attention to public piety or to visual piety in New York City might have seen his pictures in a couple of shops down 116 to Malcolm X Shabazz, the mosque around there. If you've walked there, you certainly have seen this picture. This is the unique picture of Ahmadou Bamba we have. And it's a picture that accompanies actually Murid disciple. It's everywhere. Google it. If you Google it, you'll see it everywhere. It will show up somewhere in Germany. It will show up somewhere in Tokyo. It will show up across Africa, and wherever you see a Murid, you see it. Now, what is the Muridiyya itself? Muridiyya is the Sufi order. And the Sufi order is what we call, for lack of a better name, brotherhood, but it's not really a brotherhood, because in some ways, Sufi Islam is quite friendly to women. This is an understanding of Islam where women play a major role. And they have power within these Sufi orders or network. Sufi orders are the mystical dimension of Islam, and Ahmadou Bamba was the unique black African that I know, or the unique Muslim that I know that have founded a Sufi order. All the Sufi orders that we know originated from the Gulf or from North Africa. Ahmadou Bamba is really the only person that I know that have originated one of these. Now, in what context? And this is important for us understanding the ethic of behavior of the Murid that we were talking about earlier, and why Ahmadou Bamba was so significant. So he was born around 1853, just 1 year before the French started their conquest of Senegal. So he grew up in the context of of turmoil, of violence, of conquest, and of forced incorporation of Senegal into the world market economy, forcing people to grow cash crop rather than food cropped, and in some way completely transforming political structure, but also economic and social structure. Ahmadou Bamba was quite successful in the way of finding a way of accommodating the French. He was quite happy living under French colonial rule. He did not have a problem with that. His idea as a Sufi is what is important is really building a relationship to God and spiritual purification. And so long as the French were not an obstacle in achieving that, he was happy with them. So he was open to political accommodation. He would tell the French, okay, you want us to pay taxes, I will pay taxes. Whatever you want us to do, we will do, so long as you don't prevent us from worshiping God and from doing our education. But the catch here was he was looking for economic and cultural autonomy, because he thought you really cannot be a good Muslim unless you can be independent, economically speaking, that you can produce the means for your own sustenance. And he also thought that it is possible under French colonial rule, which Muslim would call Dar al-Kufr, the house of unbelief, that it's still possible under the Dar al-Kufr, house of unbelief, to create Dar al-Islam, house of Islam. It could be done under French colonial rule. So for him, living under a secular or non-Muslim rule is not a problem, so long as you can have a way of framing the society in such a way that it responds to his idea of Dar al-Islam. That is, you can build your mosque, you can have your schools, you can teach your students, you can have your rituals, you can have your pilgrimages. If you can have those, then you can map the system as part of the land of Islam, as Dar al-Islam. So in that way, he was quite accommodating to the French, and particularly the way that he defined belief, because for him, one thing that is really central, and this is linked to the idea of autonomy, work. Work is extremely important. I quote him here where he say, work as if you will never leave this world and pray as if you knew that we will die tomorrow. So work then was important as a means of producing the resources to sustain yourself, but also as service to God. And many of the social scientists and historians who actually studied the Murid misunderstood what he meant by work. This is a little arcane, certainly, and the historical quibbling that wouldn't make sense to you. But in Arabic, you have three words for work, and the mystical understanding of it. There is amal, which is work as we understand it. You have kasb, which means gain, and there is khidma, which means service. So for somebody like Ahmadou Bamba, it was very important. The word he picked in his writing when he talked about work is very important. So khidma was the one that was really more important to him. Khidma is what we call service. And very similar to the Calvinist idea of good work. Those of you familiar with the work of Max Weber certainly understand the idea of good work. That is work that is not really aimed at producing wealth only, but work that is made to actually satisfy God. Because of the context that I designed, that I described earlier, Ahmadou Bamba became a magnet of the Senegalese people. Distraught farmers came to him, defeated kings came to him, and he became some sort of refuge, although he did not ask for it. But he became a refuge for all those people. And because he was a refuge, then he was a target for the French colonial administration. Not because he was violent, actually, because he would always say to the French, well, I am not your friend, but I'm not your enemy either. I think we can work together. If you look at the archive, you have this line always coming, I'm not your friend, but I'm your enemy. I'm not your enemy. I think we can work together. What I'm interested in, you are not interested in. I'm interested in the soul of people. You are interested in the body of people. So long as I can get the soul of the people, I don't have a problem with you. But what the French had problem with was his authority and his legitimacy and the people that surrounded him. And a legitimacy that was not rooted on French values, but on values that the French themselves don't control. That is mysticism, that is charisma. And because of that, he became a target. He was arrested in 1895, sent to exile, and that exile is very much consequential for the rest of my paper. In Gabon for 7 years, then he was exiled in Mauritania for 4 years, then he was kept under house arrest in Senegal until he died in 1927. Now, that story of Ahmadou Bamba, his exile, coming back and forth, his own mobility, all of that is going to play a role in the story that I'm telling today. Now, one thing that really jump out is that 1/3 of the Senegalese population, the Murid are 1/3 of the Senegalese population, and yet over 50% of Senegalese abroad are Murid. There is a disconnect there, and I hope I can convince you that the thing that I will be talking about in some ways played a role in that process. And another thing that is quite unique is that when you think of migration in the way push-pull theory think about it, that the poor are the people who live first, and that skilled people and wealthy people do not migrate, then the Murid is an anti-model here. Because among the Murid, those who left first were skilled artisans. Later on, traders follow. And peasant and poor peasant came later. And then those who moved actually are not the traditionally, the well-educated. If you look at African migrants today in the United States, those statistics are well known now. African immigrants are the most educated segment of the American population. The majority of them have college degree. A large majority of them have PhDs. This is not the Murid. Among the Murid, it's completely different. Those who pioneered the migration are those who were educated in traditional school, traditional Quranic school. Many of them never left Senegal, never had a passport. Their trip to New York was their first trip out of Senegal. They left their village, transited by Dakar, the capital city, and then flew to New York City or to Paris or to Tokyo or to wherever they found themselves. So this is quite different from how we understand migration, even if you look at actually African migration. So Murid migration also does not fit the narrative of international division of labor, especially in the area of the kind of neoconservative context. Those who migrate most of the time are self-employed. They create a niche. Wherever they go, they create their own niche. So these are not people that are pulled by a demand or an offer. They create their own demand. This or at least the early migration. In New York City, for example, many scholars who looked at Murid migrants argue that they created the culture of street vending. It did not exist actually, or if it had existed before, it was really little visible. They created street vending, basically. They came here and then started to sell in the street, to sell stuff. And then later on, veterans, Vietnamese veterans had license and joined them. Later on, African American joined them. But they really created this business. When you look at money transfer, also they initiated something that is not the M-Pesa that Yao was talking about, but very efficient means of transferring money by circumventing all the bureaucracy that surround the banks and Western Union and so forth. They had this system which I studied in a paper long time ago, where you can use just a phone. You need a phone. That's the only thing you need to transfer money. Because they will have somebody living in New York and having his business, and correspondent living in some markets across Africa that have their business. So you just give them a phone call and tell them, give this amount of money to this guy who will be showing up in 10 minutes. That guy show up in 10 minutes, they'll give them the money, and it's just writing. It's really very traditional, but as what Kui was telling, these also, as a history of Islam, and I think of the history of the trans-Saharan trade, actually. That's the same thing that things worked, actually. People in Cairo and people in Timbuktu would do business, and they will have just writing. I mean, this is 6 months from Timbuktu to Cairo with a caravan. Most of the time what people did was writing text. I owe you this, you owe me this, you agree in the name of Islam, that's it. In some ways, they dig into that tradition, and in 21st century America, that's the tradition actually they use until it was quit after 9/11. Because after 9/11 now, you couldn't just do things, everything changed. You couldn't do the things the way you did before. So then this migration really escapes or seems to escape the global labor supply demand. Now, what I like to dig in really is, so what is the ethic behind this? What are the values behind this? Now, one thing, Islam and migration. Islam, as we know, was founded by nomads and by long-distance traders. So these people are mobile. They move around. So Islam is very friendly to trade and to mobility and to capitalism. People might not believe it, but Islam is very friendly to capitalism. Islam is the big enemy of communism and socialism, actually. So there are also some canonical aspects of Islam that encourage mobility. Pilgrimage is one of them. Since the birth of Islam in the 7th century, Muslims everywhere have been going to Mecca. And certainly it's globalization. Folk from China, from Indonesia would find themselves in Medina, meeting with people coming from somewhere in Guinea or in Senegal, and exchanging manuscript, talking about trade. If you look at the Swahili coast, certainly, Muslims from Mombasa are found somewhere in China. This is happening in the 12th, 13th, 14th century, well before the type of globalization that we know happened today. So I think Islam, with its friendliness to migration, its friendliness to capitalism, has some role to play in this. You have also the concept of hijrah, which is migration. Islam encouraged Muslims to migrate away from land of hostility. And education, education. There is a saying of Prophet Muhammad where he said, seek knowledge as far as China. And China, of course, was the edge of the world, known world at the time, but was the edge of the world at the time. Now, for the Murid, certainly they relate to that past of Islam, but they also created their own ethic of mobility, of migration, which in some ways is linked to Ahmadou Bamba's own mobility, which sometimes was voluntary, sometimes involuntary. And they created institutions, networks, that was quite instrumental in funneling people outside of Senegal. One of those is the Dahira. The Dahira is a prayer circle. Traditionally, it was a prayer circle. And it started to emerge in Senegal among the Murid in the 1940s, when a large movement of rural-urban migration brought Murid from the countryside to the cities. So the Dahira became an institution of socialization. It helped, well, it was religiously It was a religious institution, but very quickly it took on an economic content. It became a means of socializing traders. It became a tool. Kui was talking about social capital, and it was a machine really for creating social capital. When people share belief, they tend to develop trust between themselves. They tend to generate self-policing norms. They tend to create solidarity among themselves, renting people. They tend to create means of sharing a very critical asset for an immigrant, information. That's what Dahira does. When you are part of a Dahira, you can access to all those very expensive resources if you were not part of it. And Dahira quickly, the first Dahira was created. I can't get to the detail of the paper. I'm just trying to give you the gist of it. The first Dahira was created in a market, actually, in Dakar in 1940. And now wherever you see Murid, you see a Dahira. In New York City, the last time that I count, there were around 12 of them. Many of them uniting Murid disciples. They will meet every week. Sometime, because of the context of the Western world and work schedule, they will meet maybe 2 weeks, every 2 weeks. And what do? They read the Quran. They sing Ahmadou Bamba's sacred poetry. He was a very prolific poet. And they do business too. You know, people learn about what trade works, what trade doesn't work. You know, where to sell, where is the police today? You know, how do you kind of circumvent the difficulties and so forth? These are the kind of things that also take people to those Dahira. Here you have a map of Gabon where Ahmadou Bamba was sent. I won't have time to elaborate. It's around 2,000 miles from Senegal in equatorial Africa. Senegal, of course, is in the Sahel, the west coast of Africa. And Senegalese started to go to Gabon in the 1960s. Of course, they did not go there because Ahmadou Bamba went to Gabon for exile in 1895. They went there because there were economic opportunities in Gabon. Gabon was one of the least developed French colonies. It was basically a penitentiary colony where the French would send recalcitrant colonies. They sent Ahmadou Bamba there, but they also sent Samori Touré, who is a major Muslim resistant to French colonial rule there, and other people. So it was not really developed. When Gabon was independent in 1967, and Gabon has oil, so the means really to invest, they lacked a skilled labor force. So that's, the Murid were quite instrumental in understanding this and in taking advantage of the possibility that actually Gabon offered. Many of them who were then living in Ivory Coast, Abidjan, step migrated. In my interview with them, they would always tell me, okay, I came in the Ivory Coast in the 1960s. Some came early in 1945, and they would say, but by 1960, I left. I went to Gabon. So a first wave went to Gabon in the 1960s, and most of them were actually artisans, jewelers, leather workers, and so forth. And they made tons of money. They made a lot of money there. By the 1970s, a second batch went to Gabon. These mostly are skilled workers, masons, electricians, plumbers, and so forth. And what is interesting with the second wave of Murid migrant, many of them were brought by French entrepreneurs who hired them somewhere in West Africa, mostly in Senegal, brought them to Gabon, but they will work for the French for a couple of years and quickly create their own businesses. Some of them making also a lot of fortune. And what is make Gabon quite attractive to those entrepreneurs is that Gabon did not have those middlemen that are Lebanese and petty French entrepreneurs where you found in all the French colonies. So in all the French colonies like Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal, you will find the Lebanese and petty French nationals and the middleman or the middle class. In Gabon, that middle class didn't exist. In fact, all these Senegalese were quite eager to fill that void, and they became quite productive businessmen there. So, but the story with Gabon was not only about economic opportunities. It's also about the memory of Ahmadou Bamba in Gabon. It's about the story of Gabon as being the land where Ahmadou Bamba said his religious yearning were fulfilled. So that when the Murid came to Gabon, the first thing they did was to follow Ahmadou Bamba's footprints and bodily prints. They would ask questions, where was he? Where did he live? What did he go? Where did he go? And once they found it, they tried their best to buy those places. This is not only the case of Gabon, the case of Senegal is the same, where the Murid also in the 21st century follow Ahmadou Bamba's footprints and bodily prints and try to find places where he lived, what he touched, and then buy it, to memorialize it, and to turn it into Murid space. So they found all these ordinary space around the world, and they make it extraordinary place by ritualizing it and by making it holy. And they call Gabon actually the backyard of Touba. Gabon is 2,000 miles from Senegal, but they call it the backyard of Touba, because what is important here for them, the idea of compression of time and space for them is not really about, you know, telephony. It's not about cheap labor, cheap airplanes, cheap tickets. It's about memory, it's about history. What makes Gabon the backyard of Touba is that kind of emotional connections that link that land to the land of Senegal. So here you have the first Murid business in Gabon, created in 1965 by a jeweler. I have a couple of these pictures that I will run. Yeah, but before I get to that, let me just say a little bit about the two major Murid secret sites in Gabon, and how far Murid actually went, not only to get the land itself, but to invest it, to turn that ordinary space into extraordinary place. One of those is an area that is called Sacred Mountain. It's in downtown Libreville. It's really a coveted piece of real estate in Libreville. What the Murid told me is that when they started to come to Gabon in 1965 to Libreville, they asked, and they were told that Ahmadou Bamba used to pray there, and he used to do his ablution there. And the French actually tried to kill him there, but it didn't happen. You know, the firing squad actually misfired, and he didn't happen. But what is interesting to me was the amount of sacrifice that they deployed in order to get the land. The land was owned by somebody who didn't want to buy it. A Murid tried to rent it, was successful in renting it. But when pilgrimage started, because as soon as a Murid rented the land, people started to go there in droves for pilgrimage, and the guy was not happy. Finally, the land was put in the market, and they raised the money to buy it. But what is important was not buying it, but then building the most expensive mosque a Senegalese has ever built abroad, a mosque that cost them $2 million to build. And this is coming from small money from such. This is a picture actually of the mosque, which is called Mosque Cheikh Ahmadou Bamba in Libreville. The second case study that I look at, which I will not have the time to detail here, is the Murid market, art market. Here also, the buying of the art market is very much connected to Ahmadou Bamba living in Gabon. Here also, the story of the market itself is quite interesting in the fact that not only it's in downtown Libreville, but buying it itself was really an exercise in jumping hoops. But what makes the market interesting to me, when I ask Murid, why all this sacrifice? Why did you get something else, somewhere else? They say, well, it happened that the market is located in an area where Ahmadou Bamba himself lived. And then in an area that Ahmadou Bamba used to bury money, because when he was sent to Gabon, Ahmadou Bamba was paid a stipend of 10 francs a month. And they say Ahmadou Bamba, not wanting to use French money, he used to bury that money somewhere. In fact, the market is located in where the money was buried. And they believe that having a market there would bring prosperity. And my metaphor for that is that, well, they believe that Ahmadou Bamba actually saw money there in 1895. In 2015, the money is germinating, and then they would like to profit from there. So this is where I'm going to stop. I'll just run you a couple of pictures. This is the head of the market that I was talking about, and this is the whole story of getting money from the bank, getting the loan, and it's something that I tell in the paper, and if you are interested in knowing more about it, we can talk about it. This is the kind of stuff that they sell at the market. Mostly it's an art market. Here is the mosque, the Friday mosque prayer. And what is interesting here is that you have a French sermon, which you would not have in Senegal. Another interesting thing. This is where the women pray. This is the spot where they say Amadou Bamba was actually, did his prayers, and he was subjected to a firing squad which misfired. This is a place where he lived, but this is the tomb of the first president of Gabon, and they say Amadou Bamba used to live around here. Here is a Senegalese restaurant, a Murid restaurant in Gabon. Many of the women actually are involved in restaurant. Another jewelry store. This is the Murid parade in 2015. I was in Gabon 2 weeks ago, and Murid came from Senegal and from around the world to commemorate Amadou Bamba's coming to Gabon, and once again to follow his footprints, to go wherever he has been in order to celebrate his legacy. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Professor. Very fascinating presentation. 2 questions. Within Gabon, given that the Murids have come to form the economic sort of elite or middle class, has there been resentment among the local population, as may have been present in other countries? Second, we economists tend to be cynical, and there's an economic analysis of religion saying that some institutions, they benefit from like the trust and the sharing of risk, etc. But to avoid free riding by outsiders, you make the practices and behaviors strict enough so that free riders cannot come in. In the case of the Murid, are there such filtering practices, or is it because they tend to be wall-off or from a certain region that serves as the filter in itself? Thank you.
Well, I've not seen pogrom against Murid so far. Perhaps it's because of the nature of their businesses. Well, I've seen not hostility toward the Murid themselves, but in the case of Gabon specifically, what I've seen is hostility toward West African. They call him West Af in Gabon, the West Af. But people coming from Cameroon, Equatorial Guinea, the area of Central Africa, and even the Congo don't have a problem in Gabon. But the West Af seem to have a problem. I can't understand. Maybe it's a function of the local organization. You have ECOWAS here. There you have another type of economic organization. Maybe that have played a role in the kind of divide between West African and others. But for the Murid, I haven't seen any particular hostility so far. Well, what they do is good to people, and people do not revolt against something that is good. Most of the time, these people are taxi drivers, or they sell bootleg things, cheap, and they are very close to the community. In some ways, in that sense, I haven't seen much hostility. I have seen more hostility toward them here in the United States, in Harlem and elsewhere, than I have seen, for example, in West Africa so far. Of course, in Europe, the problem is different. In Europe, it's violating regulation about street vending, because many of these Murid, what they do is street vending. And also they sell stuff that somebody was talking about mafia, that they are suspected of being in league with some kind of mafia located somewhere that make bootleg merchandise and give them to sell. I haven't seen evidence of that, but I know the history of suspecting this movement of being mafia-like come really from 19th century French thinking about Jesuit. And they're making sense of Sufi orders. When the French really started to meet Islam in Algeria in 1830, the only thing they could refer to was the Jesuit, their enemy, their mortal enemy. And that idea of linking the idea of the Sufi network to the Jesuit, it had a very long life, and you really see it in academia. Now, the idea of filter, yes, these are norm-based organizations. These are ritually delineated organizations. Of course, for any ritually delineated organization, you have people patrolling the borders. You do have it. But the way they deal with it is boycott. You exclude yourself from the community. If you misbehave, let's say if you steal, and the Murid pride themselves of saying that, well, go to the jail here, you will see other Africans, but not us. We don't do bad things. We are good people. Now, if you have somebody who sells drug or steal or something like that, you will be completely sidelined and marginalized. And that is not good if you are a trader. If you are cut off from the network, then you lose accessing information. You lose the possibility of accessing loan. you lose the possibility of benefiting from shelter. There are a lot to lose when you are out of those norms. That's, I think, the way that norm actually is shape the community.
So piggybacking on his point, I'm wondering what can other African communities or the diaspora learn from them, and what can translate. For instance, with the African Festival in Brooklyn every year, it's just known if you want a booth and they run out quickly, you got to speak to like a Senegalese entrepreneur, and they always talk about it as if it's like this mafia or this mystical type of group of people. So I'm just wondering what the relationship is between. Is it mainly relatives, or do you just belong to it if you already belong to it?
I think I've partly responded to your question about mafia. Well, Sufi orders are what they are. They are mystical orders. They congregate among themselves. They believe in mystical connection with God. They believe in knowledge beyond books, what makes them different from other Sunnis. They believe that you can have this connection with God, you can have charisma, you can have, there are a lot of things they believe in which other Muslims don't believe. And for you to benefit from that, you have to be part of the network. There is a network of disciple and sheikh, and you will be part of the network to access the knowledge. All those people that are not part of that network, of course, do not benefit also from the economic profit that come from that. And many people resent it and look at them as, but I think it's just the function of how mystical Islam actually function. It's not here, it's somewhere else also it's the same thing.
It was in Tuba that I learned the distinction between an African Muslim and an Arab Muslim. And it's that same distinction that I'm curious what happened to those immigrants to Gabon and the immigrants here. Our linguist, Lorenzo Dow Turner, traced those Africans who came to the Gullah Islands outside Georgia and the Carolinas, traced them to the Seminole Indians in Florida, and from there to the Black Indian communities in Oklahoma and in Texas and Mexico. And I see an interesting kind of parallel. If you could comment on the consequences, if you will, of localization, both for those Africans who arrived within the continent, what influence where they landed had, and then how we see that again when they came here.
Mm-hmm. This is the most exciting aspect of my research, I think. When we think of religion, we think of religion is opposite to innovation, especially when we think of Islam. These migrants are extremely innovative. I think there is a way of imagining yourself abroad, which make them quite creative in terms of culture. For example, I was referring here to sermon in French. You don't imagine doing that in Senegal. But in Gabon, you can do sermon in French. The type of organization they build. You have the typical Dahira in the context of Senegal, but if you go abroad, it's more like an NGO, for example. It's a board of trustees. It's, people are held into account. In a typical Dahira, it's trust, complete trust. You don't hold people into account. We are all believers. We are all good. Abroad, yes, you have to be held into account. Everything is documented. And what is interesting is that those religious innovations abroad impact home. Because what migration does is that it invests power and authority to marginalize people. Because being abroad, being far from home, creates space for you and give you some credibility and authority you can use to change things. So it's a loop, really. You're moving abroad and you have a space for creativity, and whatever you create also impact actually home. Thank you.